Hello there, and welcome to the daily chapter reading of How to Know God. It isn't hard to figure out what you have to do to survive in a harsh world. You have to show courage in the face of adversity. The Old Testament is a world of heroes like Samson and David who fight battles and defeat enemies. Their victory is proof that God favors them. But as we saw, no amount of effort will totally appease this God. The courage to fight must eventually turn into the courage to oppose him. If we take it back to the family, a vicious circle is involved. If you were afraid of your father because of his violent and unpredictable temper, the prospect of facing him head on will arouse even more fear. Thus, the incentive to keep quiet gets strengthened. Unfortunately, keeping quiet only makes the fear worse, since it has no release. The only way out is to overcome the hurdle, which is true at every stage of God. As in the family, the devotee of a fearful God will not move on to a higher stage until he says, "I am tired of being afraid. You are not my God if I have to hide from your anger." In social terms, we see this played out in rebellion against authority. A policeman who decides to testify against his fellow officers on charges of corruption walks a fine line. From one perspective, he is a traitor. From another, he has found a conscience. Which one is true? It all depends on where you are heading. Some people have to preserve the system, and since corruption is inevitable, they must decide how much bad can be stomached in the name of the common good. Fathers and mothers make such decisions every day over the bad behavior of their children, just as the police do over behavior under the law. But others look at the same system and decide that doing good isn't consistent with breaking the rules you are assigned to enforce. Parents can't teach truth-telling while at the same time being liars. Policemen can't accept bribes and at the same time arrest crooks. There is no clear line here. As organized religions demonstrate, it is possible to live a long time with an angry, jealous, unfair God, even though he is supposed to be the highest judge. Neither side of the line is better than the other. Ultimately, one must learn to live with ambivalence. The important issue is psychological. How much fear are you willing to live with? When this hurdle is cleared, when personal integrity is more important than being accepted within the system, a new stage begins. Thus, the exhilaration felt by many war protesters. To them, demonstrations against authority mark a new birth of morality that is guided by principle rather than outside force. Now translate this to an inner war with one voice urging rebellion and the other threatening you with punishment for breaking the law, and you have the core drama of stage one. What is my greatest temptation? Tyranny. You would think from the story of Adam and Eve that God's children were tempted to sin, but to me this is just the official version. The guardian wants you to obey, therefore he must take disobedience a wrongful act. The real temptation lies on God's side, just as it does with any protector who acts in his name. God's temptation is to become a tyrant. Tyranny is protection that has gone too far. It exists in families where the parents cannot balance rules with freedom. It exists in systems of law where mercy has been forgotten. The desire to rule is so seductive that we don't need to delve very far into this particular temptation. It is more interesting to ask how it is ever escaped. The tyrant, more often than not, has to be deposed, overthrown by force. In some societies, as in some families, this happens through violence. The children rebel against authority by killing it. This takes place symbolically, through reckless teenage behavior with drinking and driving, for example. But short of violence, there is a subtler mechanism for escaping any temptation, which is to see through the need for it. In mafia films, the gangsters inevitably run a protection racket. Under the pretext of keeping harm away from a storekeeper, They sell him insurance in the form of their protection. But this scheme works only through a lie, since the violence being held at bay comes from the gangsters themselves. They are the threat and the insurance. In spiritual terms, God's protection is valued only by denying that he is also the source of the threat. In the end, nothing is outside of the deity, so asking him to protect you from storms, famine, disease, and misfortune is the same as asking the perpetrator. I was reading a psychiatric case study in which a father was very worried about his 3-year-old daughter. The little girl couldn't sleep well and suffered from bouts of severe anxiety. The father sat up with her every night, reading fairy tales to her and trying to offer reassurance. I read to her about Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf, he told the therapist, and when she gets scared, I tell her that there is nothing to worry about. I'm here to protect her. So you can't understand why she still seems so frightened, the therapist remarked. Not at all, said the father. Do I need to be even more reassuring? No, you need to ask yourself why you choose frightening stories when she is so frightened to begin with. The answer in this case is that the father was blind by his need to be reassuring, a need root in his past. He had had an absent father who wasn't around to calm his child's fears. This is a telling anecdote because it poses the central question in stage 1. Why did God have to make such a frightening world? Was it just out of the temptation to tyrannize us? The answer doesn't lie with God, but in our interpretation of him. To get out of stage 1, you must arrive at a new interpretation of all the issues raised so far. Who is God? What kind of world did he create? Who am I? How do I fit in? In stage 2, the basic problems of survival has been overcome. There is much less need for fear, and for the first time we see the emerging influence of the new brain. Even so, just as the reptilian brain is buried inside the skull, not abolished by the cerebrum or cancelled out by higher thought, the God of stage 1 is a permanent legacy that everyone confronts before inner growth can be achieved. Stage 2, God the Almighty, reactive response. If stage 1 is about survival, stage 2 is about power. There is no doubt that God has all the power which he jealously guards. At the beginning of the scientific era, when the secrets of electricity were being discovered and the elements charted, many worried that it was sacrilege to look too closely at how God worked. Power was not only his, but rightfully so. Our place was to obey, a view that makes perfect sense if you consider heaven the goal of life. Who would endanger his soul just to know how lightning works? Freud points out, however, that power is irresistible. It is one of the primary goods in life, along with money and the love of women. Freud's worldview was inescapably masculine. If Hamlet's dilemma is rooted in stage 1, the hero of stage 2 is Macbeth, who finds it convenient to murder the king, his symbolic father, but then must wrestle with the demons of ambition. In the first act of Macbeth, when he meets the 3 witches on the heath, they predict that more and more power will come to him until in the end he is king. But this is more than a prediction. Power is Macbeth's curse. It inflames his guilt. It forces him to abandon love. He lives in the shadows of night, sleepless and afraid of being plotted against. And in the end, power drives him mad. The kind of God implied by the drive to power is dangerous, but he is more civilized than the God of stage 1. In describing this new God, we would say that he is sovereign, omnipotent, just, the answerer of prayers, impartial, rational, organized into rules. Compared to the God of stage 1, this version is much more social. He is worshipped by those who have formed a stable society, one that needs law and governance. The Almighty is not so willful as his predecessor. He still metes out punishment, but you can understand why. The wrongdoer disobeyed a law, something he knows in advance not to do. Justice is no longer so rough. The kings and judges who take their power from God do so with a sense of being righteous. They deserve their power, or so they tell themselves. As with Macbeth, the wielders of power get caught up in urges that are all but irresistible. The drama of power is based on the reactive response, a biological need to fulfill ego demands. This response has not been studied well. We can surmise that it is associated with the midbrain, which lies between the oldest animal structures of the old brain and the rationality of the cerebral cortex. This is a shadowy region, and for decades no one really believed that ego, meaning your sense of identity and personality, was innate. Then studies in infant development by Jerome Kagan and others began to demonstrate that babies do not simply learn to have a personal identity. Almost from the moment of birth, some newborns are outgoing, demanding in their needs, bold and curious about the outside world, while others are introverted, quiet, undemanding, and shy about exploring their environment. These traits persist and expand through childhood and, in fact, remain for life. This implies that the ego response is built into us. The ruling dictum of the reactive response is more for me. Taken too far, this leads to corruption, since eventually an insatiable appetite must run into the desires of others. But in biological terms, the drive for more is essential. A newborn infant exhibits a total lack of discipline and control. Child psychiatrists believe that all boundaries are fluid in the beginning. The baby is enclosed in a womb-like world where the walls, crib, blanket, and even mother's arms are still part of an undifferentiated, amorphous entity. To take this blob of sensation and find out where I begins is the first task of growing up. The birth of ego is primitive at first. When an infant touches a hot stove and draws away in shock, he remembers the pain not only as discomfort, but as something I don't want. This sense of ego is so primary that we forget what it was like not to have it. Was there a time when I saw my mother smiling down at me and felt that her emotions were mine? Apparently not. Without being able to think or reflect, the seed of ego came into the world with us. Need, desire, pain, and pleasure were felt as mine and remained that way, only growing in intensity. Nor do we find any altruistic gods in world mythology. The first commandment given to Moses is, "You shall place no other God before me." Jehovah survives all competitors in the Old Testament. We don't even witness much of a contest. But in other systems, such as the Greek and the Hindu, the war for power is constant, and one gets the sense that Zeus and Shiva have to keep their eyes open if they want to remain at the top of the pantheon. The Judaic god is a surprising victor in his emergence from a small, conquered nation that had 10 of its 12 tribes wiped off the face of the earth by powerful foes, yet the subjugated Hebrews were able to look beyond their situation. They projected a stable, unshakable God who could not be touched by any shift of power on earth, the first God Almighty to survive all challengers. Jehovah succeeded because he exemplified a world that was fast evolving, the world of competition and ambition. Raw power is violent, while the power achieved through ambition is subtle. At the level of survival, you get the food you need by stealing it from others. Sex is connected with rape or the stealing of women from another tribe. The god of stage 2 doesn't condone rape and pillage, however. He has structured a hierarchical world, one in which you can appeal to the king or the judge to settle who owns the crops and whose wife is legitimate. The struggle to bring in laws to replace sheer might divide stage 1 and stage 2, although there is always the threat of reversion. Power addicts you to getting what you want, exposes you to the temptation to trample other people's needs according to the rule that might makes right. To prevent this, we have a new God, an omnipotent judge who threatens even the most powerful king with retribution if he goes too far. Who am I? Ego personality.